well, welcome to week 6 of our Deep Dive Knowing Jesus series.
And we're getting further into his life.
We're
it's moving fast.
We're finally at some of those moments where when you think of Jesus and you think of the New Testament and some of the stories, we're getting into those.
Right there, yeah.
So this week we see Jesus going into the temple and cleansing it. We see this, we're going to talk about perhaps the most famous Bible verse, right?
Yes, the most famous.
Right, John 3:16 is in this passage. It comes in this conversation.
If you watch football, you see it.
That and Philippians 4:13. I actually saw a T-shirt the other day, like an ad on Facebook or something, and it said, I can do all things through verses I take out of context.
Oh no!
Like,
oh no!
But anyway, yes, John 3:16. You'll see it on posters and sporting events, on T-shirts, on eye paint. It's a common verse, and there's a lot
in it.
Rich stuff in it.
Yeah.
So anyway, there's a lot of text, a lot of verses this week. We're not going to go verse by verse, just kind of taking a few different themes, a few questions that we had as we were kind of looking at it and wanted to just kind of talk through that a little bit.
Fill in a few of the gaps.
Yeah, fill in a few of the gaps. So this weekend, Terry, you spent a lot of time talking through this exchange between Nicodemus and Jesus. But before that, you've got a very significant event. It's one that happens at
least twice. Yeah, sometimes we think it's once, but most commentators think it happened twice. Early on in Jesus' ministry, kind of here in this first year, and then later just before he's crucified. But yeah, we left Jesus at the wedding in Cana up in the Galilee region, the very north part, where he makes that his home base for a good chunk of time. But he's gone down to Jerusalem for the Passover, and I think we've seen, that this Passover is a marker. So he's there for a couple weeks for the celebration. And he walks in and he's just gripped with what's happened, that the place that's areas of prayer, the court of the Gentiles, where people were supposed to come to learn more about God, have been set up with these people that are taking money for sacrifices or exchanging money, because you could only use Jewish money for your sacrifice, exchanging money for the Jews who had come from Egypt or Greece or other places. And he sees the temple not being used for the way it was supposed to be used, for the worship.
We see an image of Jesus that's not necessarily in line with at least where my mind goes immediately when I think of Jesus. I think of Jesus as this calm, caring, loving. That's how he's talked about. And yet in here we see a Jesus that is upset.
Well, and we see, just in John 3 and 4, we see the wedding at Cana. He's, then overturning the money changers, then having this very erudite conversation with Nicodemus, and then we'll see next week with the woman at the well, and completely different conversation. So we see Jesus in very different ways. But this is a little challenging kind of section, because it brings up what is righteous anger. When is it okay to be angry? It's like, okay, if Jesus was perfect, how was this anger okay and other anger not? And what do we do with the anger that we have? And I always kind of differentiate offense from anger. And a lot of times we're angry because we are personally offended. Someone has hurt or wounded us. And I think in our culture now we get offended more easily, and it's almost a badge of honor to respond back to being offended. It's like, I'm offended and I have to stand up for myself.
Like our outward expression validates the offense or the thing that we're feeling or doing.
Yeah, and we can't do that. We have to equalize the offense. And I think Jesus, in his times when he was moved in what we would call anger, righteously, it was because someone else was hurt or wounded, or someone was offending here the character of God. And so Jesus stands in to defend God and his holiness and his plan. And then the gospel says, when he was offended on the cross, he surrendered to the Father. And so I think, that there's a sense of anger, that when we're angry, God is our defense and we have to trust him. And, that when we've been offended, but that we're to stand in the gap for others, and we're to go and respond, particularly for the character of God.
That's really good. So in this passage in John chapter 2, Jesus arrives at the temple, and this scene, there are these money changers and people who are selling animals at the temple for sacrifices. Could you just set the stage? Like, the temple has, we've all maybe opened up our Bibles and we see like these different diagrams or images or, pictures of the temple. Like, how is the temple constructed? Where in the temple even would this have been happening?
Yeah, and I don't, there are different courts. There was a court for women. There was the court of the Gentiles. And so this is one place, there was one place that the Gentiles could go if you were not a Jew, that it was the closest you could get to the temple. They wouldn't let a Gentile closer unless you had converted, but it was the closest you could be there, and it was designed by God as a place for seekers to come and learn more about God. And Israel was to be a light to the nation, that they were to draw people, the light, to draw people towards who God was. And so Israel was to be this representative of God and to answer these questions, so that they would come, and it's a place where people had a heart hunger for God. It would be responded to, but they had not made it that. They put it in a place where if you had to offer a sacrifice, you could buy animals. If you were traveling in, they'd make it easier, or that you would change currency to use the temple currency.
Which pragmatically makes sense.
Pragmatically
to have that be close to the place that you need to be able to do. But I think the ironic thing here, at least that as I'm reading this, is the Jews would be the ones who would be making these sacrifices, and right. And so the selling of these animals and the money changing was happening in the court of the Gentiles, where the God-fearers were. And so that was disrupting the worship because the Gentiles couldn't go in any further.
Right.
And I think that's what we see Jesus get real upset about, is that like God's mission, like the people of God were meant to be a light to the rest of the nations. And the people of other nations were meant to come and to know God and to be able to worship God, and the Jews were actually subverting their own identity and role as being a light to the nations by disrupting the worship of God. So I don't know. I just think there's something there that Jesus gets upset when God's mission is getting interrupted.
And then you get later on the other, another gospel writer talks about, you've turned the house of prayer into a den of thieves. That this was also a place, quoting from the Old Testament, where to be a place to go and pray and speak. And then you get to the second time that he overthrows the money changers. It's, just before he's crucified, and you've got Caiaphas and Annas, and who are the leaders, and it's kind of their kids who are running the temple courts and the money changers. And so the high priests are getting a cut of money off of this all. So it really does get kind of messy, all these layers of things that are there. And she's like, we're just come to worship God. God just wants to be known. And you should be here telling people about the wonder of God and who he is. And you're not. You're trying to make a buck.
Yeah, absolutely. There's so much happening there. We only get this little snippet, and we love taking things out of context, right? So we see it just a Jesus. He forms a whip, right? And he's driving these people out of the temple.
And it's always a challenge, I would just say, transparency, we struggle with this whole concept. There are some churches that have a lot bigger places that sell stuff and have merch, or sell things. And we try to minimize that. So, I don't think that verse is saying you can't sell anything or you can't exchange money in the church. I don't think it's saying that. But we really do try to be conscious of that and not make money a big topic.
No, I'm glad you brought that up, because I do think that I remember having a conversation with Mike Sherman when this was probably, I had just been hired, or it was maybe even before I joined, and it was this conversation of like the business side of the church and the ministry side of the church, and like you don't really get one without the other, right? They have to, it works, has to work together. But there's a tension there when it comes to money, when it comes to, we want to be pragmatic, we want to be efficient, we want to be excellent, right? But at the same, we want to cater to people's needs. So there is a fine line. So I appreciate you bringing that up and saying that.
And I would say the business of the church can't undermine the business of the church.
Yeah.
You know, that we are about kingdom business and we have a plan, and the other part cannot get in the way or eclipse that or undermine that. But you know, that's where, you know, encourage people that Sunday is for worship. It's not trying to get meetings done and work done and everything else. It is for worship and what we are about in the business of the kingdom.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you something about verse 17 here, right? It says his disciples remembered that it was written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." So this is at the end of this kind of this scene, and I'm just reminded of how intentional Jesus is. Like, even in his anger, that's emotion, and he's doing something with it. But there's also, you know, even in his person and his action, there's this understanding of, hey, there's prophecy that he is fulfilling, and there's a bigger picture and a bigger thing that's happening than even just responding in that moment. I think a lot of times whenever we get angry, right, we even want to like describe our own anger sometimes as righteous anger, right? To justify it. And even in our anger, though, like, we're not to sin. Right.
Yeah, be angry and sin not. That there's a sense that anger is an appropriate emotion, and if you don't have any anger at things, then you're not alive, right? Or you're not seeing justice or injustice done. But yeah, how do we handle it? What do we do to solve the problem or move things forward? And again, you know, I think just the zeal, the zealousness Jesus had for worship and the passion for God and people meeting with God and being there and not being hindered in that.
Yeah, no, that's really good. And following verse 17 here in verse 18, he's then asked, right? It'd be like somebody comes into the church and starts doing, it's like, hey, on whose authority are you doing this? Like, what's going on, man? Like, and so the Jews, they ask him, what sign do you show us for doing these things, right? And then he kind of gives this answer, hey, destroy the temple, right? I'll raise it again in 3 days. So even there,
it's prophetic. It's revealing something. He's talking about himself. You know, they're thinking, wait a minute, you can't destroy this. He's not going to rebuild what took years to rebuild. He's talking obviously about himself. That's the ultimate authority. You know, how do we know Jesus is the Son of God? How do we know it's the resurrection? Everything points to then. I'm always amazed, you know, look at this, that they seem to kind of take Jesus at his word. Like, they were obviously angry, but I think because Nicodemus comes and says, I know you are a prophet, because no one else could do the things of God, the people obviously realize there is something different about him. He's just not some crazy person, or he's not just got an agenda. There's something there that we have to know. And there, you know, you wish you could see that firsthand, the demeanor that Jesus had, how he walked in that authority. And I do think we see that sometimes in life. There are people that you just trust, you listen to. When they speak, you really listen, and you may disagree, but it's like, okay, you know, if so-and-so says that, I'm going to really take that to heart. And Jesus must have somehow had that stature and demeanor. And, you know, people can have power and control, but there is a sense of spiritual authority that people do listen to, and Jesus had that. And I think obviously Nicodemus saw that.
Yeah, he recognized that and responded to it. So anyway, Jesus, he says this, right, in 3 days. And I'm always fascinated when he equates, like, the temple as a building and the temple as a body, right? Like, you know, he essentially is describing himself as a temple, right? And which is the important thing about the temple, because that's where the presence of God is.
Which we become. We then become, when God's spirit and presence is in us, we then become the same way. We're a holy temple. We're a place that is a spiritual building. Yeah.
Well, then the Jews, they say, it's taken us 46 years to build this temple. So that Jesus is always saying these things, and they're like trying to take him so literally, you know. And so 46 years, what's that? Like, when they say it's taken us 46 years, when was this temple
Well, I think they're referring back to what we talked about with Ezra and Nehemiah too, in the rebuilding of the temple and the wall, and going back. It's like, hey, look, this did not happen overnight to get us here. It was a big deal, an endeavor.
Well, and I think too, and again, the 46, maybe the specificity of that. Maybe they're talking about Herod the Great coming in and renovating Jerusalem. But when you think about the temple being built or constructed, you see that in the Old Testament a few different times. Like, it's not a quick act, right? It's a long process. We see that even just here, right? If you drive down Jungerman Road, like that process of rebuilding or doing things is a long time. And so Jesus, when he says, hey, I'm going to rebuild this in 3 days, they're kind of like, wait, what are you talking about? No.
Yeah, they can't even imagine, and they don't get that he's really talking about himself.
Yeah.
And we probably wouldn't at the time, honestly. We would not.
No, yeah, we want to give the Jews a little bit of credit,
right?
Because like they do not have the benefit of being this side of the cross, right? Where we can read the New Testament, we can read the things that Jesus said and understand that he meant something different than would have been taken. So then continuing this, verse 21, he was speaking about the temple of his body. And then when he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered he had said this, and they believed the scripture and the word that Jesus had spoken. Now this is kind of coming after the fact, right? The disciples, we see in this band of followers that Jesus has, there's this progression of understanding and trust and belief in who Jesus is and the things that he said. So much so that they're still in the process of believing and understanding after Jesus has already already died.
Well, and we're going to see there that I love how John sets this up. He does a great job. So the wedding at Cana, the water to wine, the water and blood at the cross. See in this situation the temple 3 days and rebuilt, and it's the cross. We're going to see in Nicodemus, the connection between what Jesus says there and the cross. If the Son of Man is lifted up, and Nicodemus being the one to lift him back down. We're going to see it with the Samaritan woman, which we're going to look at next week, and he says to her, I'm thirsty, give me a drink. The only other time he says he's thirsty is on the cross. So it's almost like every one of these, he's previewing kind of what's going to happen, and John's bringing these
doing
together.
a great job of foreshadowing with all of these. And again, there's so many events he could have drawn from, right? And so these gospel writers, when they are choosing specific moments, they're doing so because they're trying to tell a specific story.
Right.
And for John, one of the biggest things that he cares about is he wants people to believe in Jesus as the Son of God, right? As the Messiah, as the sacrificial lamb, right? He wants as the light of the world, right? And so in here, you have this kind of this wordplay. In verse 22, right? They believed the scripture. And then in 23, he kind of continues where people are believing in his name, but then Jesus on his part did not entrust himself to them, right? And that's got the same root word.
Right. So the idea of believe is not just understand or it really is trusting in the truth. And the classic example, as a Canadian, the classic example is I can believe that people have walked a tightrope across Niagara Falls. This is a big one because people have.
Sure, crazy.
But
crazy
would
people.
you trust them to walk you across Niagara Falls, right? You can believe that someone does it, but would you really put their trust in? And so this is kind of Jesus, that the word believe, and it's the same, anyone who believes in him will have everlasting, is going to put their full trust. Okay, there's no way else I'm going to get to heaven. There's no way else I'm going to have eternal life. But him, I'm putting my full trust in who he is. So
yeah, and I love what John's doing here because he's comparing and contrasting those who are believing in him, and yet Jesus knows the hearts of all men. He does not entrust himself, right? To them. And again, that same word in Greek would be, pisteuo, right? That verb, and so there's a connection there. I do think that's an interesting and I'm glad that you made that designation of what is belief. It's not just understanding. It's understanding, but it's followed by
I'm going to live this
action.
out.
Yeah.
Which is then Nicodemus comes and wrestles with this whole idea
Yeah.
of belief and trust, right?
Yeah.
What am I gonna do?
Well, let's jump into chapter 3. So
Yeah.
we've got a few minutes left, and this is just setting the stage for this conversation that
Right.
Jesus and Nicodemus has. So,
Right.
so Nicodemus, he's this Jewish ruler. He's a
Pharisee. Right.
What does that mean? That's the first time.
So,
we've
I mean,
looked at that.
yeah, he was then a religious leader. He devoted himself really to the Old Testament law. The Pharisees really put a lot of trust in the Pentateuch, the first 5 books. We're kind of living them out in detail. We have the Sadducees, who are a little bit more political. We're based more on kind of the priesthood after that, but really we're working with Rome and trying to
The
create.
Sadducees, they were in the temple.
They were in the temple too.
Yeah.
Yes. So, but the Pharisees were there. But Nicodemus is more, in addition, was a member of the Sanhedrin, the Supreme Court, the civil court, 70 leaders. They were, decision makers that were there. And so, and the teacher of Israel was probably a significant person above that, was really looked up to, well respected. And, so here, one of the first real encounters Jesus has, he's in Jerusalem. I mean, he's with probably the person most difficult to get an appointment with.
Yeah.
And Nicodemus comes to him.
He seeks Jesus out.
He seeks him out.
At
Yeah.
night.
Right. And what's Nicodemus, that's a risk. Obviously, he doesn't want to be seen or recognized. I mean, Jesus has just upended the temple. Everybody's probably got their own opinion, so he doesn't want to be there. But, think of how you feel. It's like, wait a minute. You don't want to be seen with me? How does that make you feel?
Yeah.
And Jesus, what I love is there's all sorts of opportunity for, antagonism to occur, and they just really have a sincere conversation. And Nicodemus is a student. He says, the chief teacher, he says, I know you're a rabbi.
Yeah, he
So
refers
there's
to him
something-
as rabbi, and that's Jesus who, he's this popular guy at this point,
Yeah.
but he hasn't had the full formal rabbinical training that would merit somebody who has had that, referring to
Right.
him as
A rabbi, right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Nicodemus obviously recognized, there's something about his teaching, which, you assume going back in the temple, Jesus, what he was saying was more elaborate than kind of what we have in the few verses. He probably spent much more time teaching. He was obviously teaching in other scenarios and situations. We see him right after this staying around Jerusalem, teaching and baptizing people.
Yeah, so good. And so there's a lot we can unpack in just this little
Sure,
dialogue
yeah.
that they have. But I want to kind of focus on kind of verses 16 and following. There's this word that pops up a bunch, and that's the word light. We see that a lot in John's gospel. Let's just talk about that a little bit. Like, what does Jesus mean, right? When he uses this word light, what are some of the images that it pulls from?
I think, in the Old Testament, it was used to speak of God, that God is a light, that he's the one we look to. He illuminates, he makes things clear. Israel was to be a light to the nations, that to draw. We are drawn to light, and so that's part of who Jesus is. We're to be that light, and then we are to be light. We're to shine that to others. Jesus says that in the Sermon on the Mount, that part of our job is to be a light to other people. And that God is revealing, and I think that sin obviously hides things. We hide things, and we say it's brought out into the light. And God is a light. He wants to expose the best, but he wants to expose what needs to be gotten rid of as well.
Yeah, we see this word come up in 1 John as well, like a bunch.
Yes,
right,
a lot.
John loves this image, and I do think that, and again, he wants people to believe in Jesus as the Son of God, but he's also wanting them to live out their faith, right, and to essentially step into this identity that they are the
light of the world,
light of
right?
the world, and the light to the nations. And I think we do this too. So I don't want to hark on them too much, but the Jewish people so often would take all of these blessings and privileges and comforts, right, and enjoy them, right, for themselves. And they were always meant to be for the good of the whole world. And I think that's one of the things John is doing here in this dialogue between Jesus and Nicodemus. Is he's talking to one of the chief Jewish leaders, and the thing that he's trying to remind him of, even in these, I think subtly maybe, is it's not about you, it's not about us, it's about the whole world.
Well, yeah. And that's what Jesus came for God so loved the whole world, right? He came for everyone, and trying to, Jesus telling the gospel. Religion is us trying to be good enough to get to God, which is Nicodemus, is living his whole life in a faithful enough way so I can get to the kingdom or have a relationship with God. And Jesus is like, you can't do it.
Yeah.
You can't. You have to be born of water and spirit. You have to be sprinkled by God. You have to have, the Spirit of God in you. It's not you, Nicodemus. Yeah. It's what's done for you.
No, that's so good. And there's this bookend, right, of Jesus driving out the money changers, driving out those who are disrupting the worship of people who are not Jewish.
Right.
Right. And then on the other side of this is John 3:16 and highlighting that it's about the world, and it's about everybody.
Right. And that goes back, Israel was to be the light. Now we are to be the light. The Gentiles, the church, the people of God get to be grafted in, and we become that what God wants. That He wants to draw people, which we are drawn to light, right? We're always drawn to a warm light, and so that we're drawn to that, and we're drawing other people to it.
No, that's so good. And next week we're going to see another encounter that Jesus has.
Another encounter, the woman at the well. Go together. And so different. That's what we're going to, it's so different. And we have kind of more of a truth encounter, kind of an intellectual, and then just a grace encounter. And Jesus meets people. And, the woman is all of us. It's not just women. It's not just about women. The woman is all of us.
Awesome.
So
cool. Can't wait. It's going to be good.
That's good.
Again, hopefully you have found this to be helpful as we just kind of try to dive deeper into the passages and the stories that we are hitting on the weekend in our Knowing Jesus series. You can find more resources on our YouTube channel or on our website, calvary.church/knowingjesus. We'll catch you next week.